The flames roared behind her like a beast unleashed, black smoke curling into the sky as sirens echoed down the street. In the middle of it all, an elderly black woman marched forward with unwavering purpose, her face fierce, her hands clenched. The car being consumed by fire? It was hers, parked legally, untouched until riot control police decided it was in the way. She hadn't even been near the protest. Now, her lifeline, her transportation, her independence, was a pile of metal and fire. As officers laughed and shrugged, brushing off the damage like ash on their uniforms, bystanders began filming. Their expressions shifted from confusion to outrage. But Miss Loretta James didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just stared them down and turned away. 10 minutes later, those same officers would learn who she really was, and regret everything. Before we dive in, drop your city in the comments and follow us for stories where truth burns brighter than any flame. The sun hung low over the downtown skyline, casting long shadows across a city still vibrating with unrest. Earlier that day, a protest had surged through the streets, voices raised, signs lifted high, but by early evening, the crowd had mostly dispersed. Sirens still echoed in the distance, and a haze of smoke lingered above shattered glass and smoldering trash bins. Amid the fading chaos, Ms. Loretta James made her way down the block, walking carefully with a cloth tote slung over one shoulder and the scent of chalk and paper still clinging to her sweater. At 72, she was as steady as they came. A retired schoolteacher who spent her days tutoring underprivileged kids, one of the few elders who still believed change starts with a book, not a bullhorn. She wasn't wealthy, but she held, her head higher than most millionaires. She'd left the tutoring center just minutes earlier, only to round the corner and find her old Ford engulfed in flames. A line of officers stood nearby, relaxed, chatting as if the fire behind them was no more than a trash can blaze. Leading the group was Officer Briggs, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing his badge like armor. His smirk stretched as he watched Loretta approach. "Another casualty of cleanup," he said, waving a gloved hand toward the car. "Wrong place, wrong time." The others chuckled. Loretta didn't. She stared at the flames silently, jaw set, eyes locked on what was once her independence. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, just stood there, unmoving. But behind her quiet presence was a storm brewing. There was something in her gaze that said this wasn't over. And for Officer Briggs and his team, the real fire hadn't even started yet. Miss Loretta. James walked toward the chaos with a calm that could silence a room. Her feet moved steadily over broken glass and scattered protest signs, her eyes fixed on the wreckage that used to be her car. Before she could get too close, a young officer stepped in front of her, hand raised like she was a threat. "Ma'am, please stay back," he said, barely looking at her. Loretta didn't stop. She raised her arm and pointed directly at the flaming vehicle, her voice steady. "That's mine." The officer blinked, then turned toward his superior. "Officer." Briggs, who stood with his hands on his vest, watching the fire like it was part of a routine drill. Briggs looked Loretta over and smirked. "Should have moved it when you had the chance, ma'am," he said, voice laced with smugness. A couple of the other officers chuckled. One of them pulled out a phone to take a photo, clearly more interested in the spectacle than the damage they'd caused. Loretta's hands didn't tremble. She didn't scream or cry. She asked, calmly and firmly, for a report, for an explanation. "I wasn't part of the protest. I parked legally. I want to know why my car is in flames." But all she got in return were shrugs and smirks. "We did what we had to do," Briggs replied, turning back toward his fellow officers, clearly done with the conversation. That was when the phones came out, not just theirs, but the bystanders. Several people standing across the street had begun filming the exchange. A woman whispered to her partner, "That's Loretta James. She used to teach at Lincoln High." Another voice added, "She's the one who runs the tutoring center on 5th. Loretta looked around once, her gaze sweeping across the cameras and the smoke, then turned back to the officers. She said nothing more. No threat. No final words. She simply turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps deliberate. Briggs laughed behind her. "Guess she got the message," he muttered to the others. But Loretta wasn't walking away in defeat. She was walking toward something. And 10 minutes later, those same officers would realize just how big of a mistake they'd made. Because Loretta James didn't lose battles, she let people walk right into their own reckoning. 10 minutes passed. Just 10. The fire had been extinguished, leaving behind a scorched frame of twisted metal and memories. Officers stood chatting, relaxed again, convinced the moment had passed. But then, without warning, an unmarked black SUV turned the corner and came to a smooth stop at the edge of the cordoned street. It was sleek, clean, and unmistakably official. The doors opened. Out stepped a woman in a navy blazer, tailored slacks, and heels that clicked against the pavement like a judge's gavel. Her presence turned heads instantly, her stride confident, purposeful, unfazed by the smoke still curling in the air. U.S. District Attorney Nadia Reyes didn't pause. She walked directly toward Ms. Loretta James, who had been standing off to the side, arms folded, quiet as always. But this time, the silence held thunder. Nadia opened her arms and embraced Loretta, like family because that's what she was. Cameras from bystanders and news crews turned instantly. Murmurs swept through the crowd like a wave. "Wait, is she hugging that woman? Isn't that the federal prosecutor?" The officers froze, every smirk vanishing. Officer Briggs, mid-sentence, blinked hard as Nadia turned to face him, her face sharp with authority. "I need the names of every officer who was present when this woman's car was burned," she said, her voice calm but each word slicing through the air. Immediately, Briggs took a half-step back, his confidence crumbling. "Ma'am, we were responding to a riot. It was protocol." Nadia cut him off with a look. "Do you know who this is?" she asked, gesturing toward Loretta. "Do you have any idea the work this woman has done in this city? The lives she's changed? She was my tutor when I was 13. She paid for my LSAT books. She is the reason I even became an attorney. And today, your team burned her car and laughed in her face." Loretta hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. She stood behind Nadia, her face composed, her silence louder than any outrage. It was a silence that demanded accountability, a silence that made Officer Briggs shift. Uncomfortably in his boots, Nadia took a breath and looked around at the stunned officers. "Get me their badge numbers. This is no longer local jurisdiction. This is federal." Briggs opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. The street that had once felt like a playground of unchecked authority had transformed into a courtroom under open sky, and they had no defense. Ms. Loretta James remained still, calm as ever. But this time, the calm wasn't quiet. It was commanding. and it echoed through the block louder than any siren. The truth unraveled not with drama, but with devastating clarity. As reporters swarmed and officers scrambled, word spread fast. This wasn't just some angry bystander. This was Ms. Loretta James, and the woman who had marched from the black SUV wasn't just a prosecutor. She was someone Loretta had raised. At age 12, Nadia Reyes had been a shy, brilliant girl whose future was almost dimmed by poverty and circumstance. It was Loretta who had taken her in after school, offering warm meals and even warmer wisdom. Loretta had tutored her through every paper, every entrance exam, and when Nadia couldn't afford the LSAT study materials, Loretta bought them without hesitation. "Invest in brilliance," she used to say. "The world will catch up later." And now it had. Nadia had flown in from D.C. just for dinner with Loretta that night. But when she got the message, just a brief text that read, "They burned my car. I didn't raise my voice." She didn't wait for dessert. She came straight to the scene, because to her this wasn't about a vehicle. It was about how easily dignity could be scorched by unchecked power. What the officers thought was just another incident, a footnote in a chaotic day, had sparked a federal storm. Within the hour, Internal Affairs launched a preliminary review. The footage already circulating online showed everything: Loretta's quiet approach, her calm voice, the officers' smirks, and the fire crackling behind them. It was impossible to ignore. By morning, headlines stretched coast to coast. Federal attorney confronts police over elderly woman's burned car. Civil rights groups called for accountability. City officials issued hasty statements. But it wasn't just public pressure that ignited action. It was the power of connection. The burning car hadn't just been property. It had been a match. And Loretta's silence had been the spark. Now, flames of justice were spreading in the direction they always should have. In the weeks that followed, the fire that had destroyed Loretta James's car ignited something far greater than the officers ever anticipated. Officer Briggs and the members of his team were placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. One by one, body cam footage, civilian videos, and witness statements painted a picture that no press release could spin. The disciplinary hearings began behind closed doors, but the consequences rippled outward. Community trust had been fractured, and now the department had to face the reckoning. Meanwhile, something else unfolded, something far more powerful than punishment. The city, embarrassed by its officers' actions and moved by the overwhelming public support for Loretta, organized a formal ceremony in her honor. At the Grand Civic Auditorium, leaders, activists, students, and neighbors packed the seats. The mayor presented Loretta with a framed proclamation recognizing her decades of tireless service as an educator, mentor, and advocate. But when they handed her a check to cover the cost of her car, she gently pushed it back. "Put this where it matters," she said, her voice clear but kind. "There's a generation that still needs books, not just buses." The check was reissued, not to her, but to the community tutoring program she had built from scratch years ago. That same week, enrollment in the center doubled, and volunteers poured in. Nadia Reyes, now a national figure, stood at the podium, her voice thick with emotion. "This woman didn't just teach me grammar and math. She taught me how to listen, how to lead. She taught me justice, not the kind written in law books, but the kind that begins in someone's heart." Young people in the neighborhood, many of whom had grown up hearing Miss Loretta's stories, now wore them like armor. They defended her in online forums, stood with her in marches, and quoted her lessons like scripture. One teenager spray-painted a mural on the wall beside the tutoring center, a portrait of Loretta standing calm in front of the burning car with the words, "Power doesn't shout, it stands still." Even within the police department, there was movement. Officers who once shrugged off community engagement now sat through cultural training sessions with notebooks open. A few requested to meet Loretta. She agreed, on the condition that they first spend an hour reading with kids at her center. She didn't want apologies. She wanted investment. And so the city began to shift. Not all at once, not in grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but in quieter ways, in meetings held with humility, in stories retold with care, in youth who grew up seeing someone fight injustice with grace instead of rage. Loretta never sought revenge. She didn't need to. Her life had always been about planting seeds, not burning bridges. That day on the street, when her car burned and the officers laughed, they thought they'd humiliated a helpless old woman. But what they really did was hand her the microphone, one built not from anger, but from a lifetime of earned respect. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks in quietly, carrying books instead of badges, and leaves behind something far more permanent than fear. It leaves behind justice. She didn't raise her voice. She raised a generation. In a world that often rewards the loudest, the flashiest, the most aggressive, Ms. Loretta James proved that real power is quiet, steady, and undeniable. Her silence in the face of disrespect wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. And when the truth stepped out of that black SUV, the world was forced to listen. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who've already changed everything. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, ignored, or dismissed until the world finally caught up to who they really were? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a teacher, a mentor, a grandmother who led with grace instead of fury, then share it. Send it to someone who needs to remember that quiet dignity speaks volumes. And don't forget to follow us for more true stories where karma doesn't come screaming, but arrives with truth, with justice, and with the kind of strength that never needs to shout.